Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog here on the live stream with me, Lowkey. On Mint Press, week in, week out, we are covering multiple stories which the mainstream media regularly ignore. And it is for that reason that we would massively appreciate all and any support you can give us. So please click like, share, and subscribe on our videos. And we hope that you will support the people that we bring to you on the Watchdog. Now, this week we have a very special guest, somebody who, when I was in the sniper and my work on Spotify was under threat, this is one of the few people who reached out to me. I received great support from many people, but in terms of actually being given the chance to say my side of the story, this was one of the few people who did that and supported me. I'm very grateful to her for that. We are joined this week by some intermittent disturbances in the audio. Let's just try and work on this for 1 second. How is that now in terms of audio? Is that better? Yeah, is that better? Okay, so we will do it like this. So we're joined this week by Katie Halper, who has very recently been dismissed from her job at The Hill. This is something that many people on the internet have commented on and been outraged about. Katie is a journalist and somebody who has very much built her own platform independent of The Hill. To start with, Katie, if you could break down for us, what exactly was your job at The Hill?
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. I was a weekly contributor, so I was a guest every week on The Hill show called Rising. I did that for 3 years, basically. I would come on every week. I would do a media segment. And then I had also recently started doing some hosting. So they paid me to come on as a host. And when you're a host, you host a bunch of segments. But another thing that you do when you're a host is you do these things called radars. And radars are basically monologues. They're straight to the camera. You just deliver them. You have a take, a position, an opinion. They're kind of video op-eds. And I decided that I hosted. This was my 4th time hosting, and I had wanted to at first make sure that I mastered the hosting, so I didn't do any monologues or radars. And then I decided, okay, I got that under my belt. Like I figured out how to host. I'm going to do my first radar, my first monologue. And there were 3 different topics I had planned to address because I had actually booked, they had me commit to 3 additional hosting gigs. So one of them was going to be on Israel-Palestine, one was going to be on Ukraine, and one was going to be on immigration. And I think it's funny because I'm sure if I had started with either of the 2 other ones, I'd probably still be at The Hill right now. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But what I addressed was Rashida Tlaib, who is a congresswoman from Michigan. She's a Democrat. She's part of the squad. She had addressed a Justice for Palestine conference virtually. She delivered virtual comments. She said that people are realizing more and more that you can't be progressive while supporting Israel's apartheid government. She said that you can't be progressive except for on Palestine. And what happened then is that she was kind of immediately attacked by several people, including Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, who not only suggested it was anti-Semitic, but he also said Israel's not an apartheid state. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the very corrupt Democratic congresswoman from Florida, also tweeted against her. Richie Torres, who's a congressman who fashions himself as progressive and does a lot of pinkwashing for Israel, also tweeted against her. So I decided that I would defend her from these attacks and also make the case that Israel is indeed an apartheid state. I also used as a jumping off point a segment that Jake Tapper has done, and Jake Tapper kind of has a history of being pretty bad on this issue, and also picking on Rashida Tlaib. So I made a video. I wrote the script. I worked on it very hard because I knew that if you address things about Israel, you're going to have a lot of people trying to discredit what you're saying. So I made the case that Israel's an apartheid state by referring to international law, so the United Nations, because apartheid is actually a legally defined crime according to international law. So I cited the UN, I cited the International Criminal Court, I cited human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. I cited and quoted B'Tselem, which is the Israeli human rights organization. Then I cited and quoted several, it's pretty fascinating, actually. A lot of Israeli officials, ministers, have said that it's apartheid or warned that it's going to become apartheid. Also, prime ministers have said that, even in a recently publicized interview that Yitzhak Rabin gave in 1976. He even said, he warned that it would turn into an apartheid state if they kept occupying the way that they were. And of course they have. And then I quoted Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, because of course, you know, the people who really understand apartheid are those who lived through it. And those are the South Africans, Black South Africans. I mean, white South Africans lived through it too, but obviously in the different position from the Black South Africans who were ruled over by through apartheid. Apartheid's an Afrikaans word. It means apartness, basically. So I quoted them, and then I cited a foreign minister of South Africa who had just addressed the United Nations General Assembly, and she actually was citing the overwhelming research and kind of consensus about Israel's apartheid state. And she also cited Daniel Levy, who was an Israeli negotiator at Oslo Accords. And so you have a bunch of Israelis saying this, which is fascinating.
And so, just to check now, how is my audio? If there's any problem with my audio, people, please do leave a comment and let me know. But just to check then, Katie, what was the next event in that series of events? What was the trajectory from there?
Right. So I recorded that. I did more hosting. Then I left for the day. And as I was leaving, I got a phone call from one of the producers. And she told me that she wanted me to hear from her that higher ups at the Hill would be, had seen the stream and decided that they weren't going to run it. And I asked why they weren't going to run it. And she said that they had a policy of which she had not been aware. And the policy was that they were against, they did not allow people to do op-eds on Israel. So you couldn't do an op-ed either written or video on Israel. She told me that she didn't know that. Had she known that, she would have told me ahead of time. So I thought that was a little strange. And she was, I mean, the producers were understanding. And I think that they also wanted the radar, the monologue to run. Again, they had recorded it. I was willing to, I was trying to see if they could run the radar and then have an opposing view if they wanted to. I was willing to have a debate afterwards. I was talking to the producers over the course of about 3 days because this happened on a Monday. By Wednesday, I got a call from the editor-in-chief of The Hill, Bob Cusack, who told me they wouldn't be running the radar. I asked why. He said, because they get lots of pitches and they don't take all the pitches, which was just a totally bogus reason, because as people will tell you who work there, there's no editorial process for these radars, for these monologues. They trust their hosts usually to write what they write, say what they have to say, and they can, if people disagree, that's fine, but there's no review process. Brian Grimm, who wound up writing about this, said that he estimated he did about 150 of these radars and no one ever had any, editorial interference with it. So that was ridiculous. Then he said another reason was that it wasn't in their sweet spot, which is more domestic coverage. Now, this is a story about Rashida Tlaib, who's obviously an American congresswoman. She's also the first Palestinian American congresswoman. But even that argument is bogus, because I know from being a guest and from hosting that international stories are frequently part of the Rising's repertoire. So when I heard that from him, I texted the producers and I was like, okay, so they're not going to run the radar. They're not going to run the monologue. Can I talk about it during my segment? So this sounds a little inside baseball, but basically segments are the things that are not straight to cam monologue. So when I appear every week, I was appearing every week over the course of 3 years, I would do a segment. And the producers had told me their policy was against op-eds, no op-eds on Israel, but you could do a segment. So once they told me they weren't going to run the op-ed, I was like, okay, so can I talk about it during my segment? And then the producer said, check your email. And that's when I got an email from a Nexstar and executive from the Hill and Nexstar telling me, hi, Katie, we won't be needing you to do your segment tomorrow. Please feel free to send any unpaid invoices, and best of luck. So they just basically, after 3 years of working with the Hill, it took them 3 days of me just trying to get my radar out there, or then being flexible and saying, okay, we don't have to do the op-ed. Let me at least just talk about this on the show, which you had said I could do. So then they were done with me. Can I respond to a comment?
Yes, please do.
So this is I find this a very frustrating thing. And actually, it's a good opportunity to clarify someone. Someone wrote, I believe that Katie Halper knew full well that the Hill is an imperial propaganda outlet and would not approve of any statements regarding Palestinian rights. Did she do this for likes and fame? Okay. I had been on the Hill, as I said, for 3 years, and I was on there as a guest. I would go on every week. I spoke about Israel several times. I said Israel lied about killing Shireen Abu Akleh. There was no precedent for them censoring me on Israel. So no, I did not do this for fame and likes. Maybe that's something that you're projecting. Maybe that's how you operate. That's not how I operate, but thanks for sharing your personal psychology.
What a fantastic response there from Katie. Just to check, how is my audio now? Am I audible to you, Katie?
You are audible. There's a little bit of glitchiness, but I think you're less glitchy. You may want to, if you haven't already done this, close every other program. Make sure if there's anyone else in the house streaming or anything.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. So I'll ask you a question now, Katie, and I'll keep it as brief as possible. How did it feel when you were treated this way by someone you had been employed for 3 years?
It felt, am I allowed to curse or no? It's okay if I'm not. Okay. It felt really, okay, I'll say crappy. It felt really crappy because family show. It was very, I felt very discarded. I really didn't expect it because look, the Hill is corporate media, but their shtick, I don't know if your English audience will know that term, but their thing is kind of that they let people say things outside of the mainstream, outside of what's allowed in corporate media. They do, to be fair. I mean, I had talked about Israel a bunch. I had talked about Ukraine a bunch. I said things that you're really not allowed to say in corporate media. But what happened is that we discovered that that's probably more about it being profitable and monetizable than a real commitment to free speech or a real commitment to discussions that go outside of the usually allowed very narrow range of political opinions. So I didn't think that they would censor me on this. And then I certainly didn't think that they'd fire me on it. I should also add that I had recently recorded a pilot. I had pitched the Hill a pilot series that was basically like a left-wing version of The View. So an all-women's panel show, but instead of having representation across the political spectrum, it was just going to be leftist women. And we even shot that pilot. They released a segment of it. It did really well. It was me. It was Brianna Joy Gray and I hosting and having on Abby Martin and Ronnie Kallick, who your viewers and listeners, I'm sure, know of. They were on, and so the Hill was not unhappy with my work. They had just edited that pilot. They were happy with it. They were excited about moving forward with it. So this was a purely ideological decision. Brianna Joy Gray, who's one of the regular hosts at The Hill, did a really brave discussion on this monologue, really, where she condemned The Hill's decision. She decided to stay there because I think she, like I did, wanted to use a very big megaphone and big platform to get out messages from the left. So she's still there, but she very bravely condemned what they did. She did not buy their excuse that it was a stylistic choice to not run the radar, which I don't think anyone is buying, honestly. And then she condemned them, and then we really did a deep dive on both of our channels. You can find it at her YouTube, or you can find at youtube.com/the Katie Halper Show. We did a kind of a deep dive into all the reasons that what The Hill said was total BS. But I felt very like discarded, thrown away, kind of like they saw me as useless, obviously expendable, dispensable, replaceable. So that was really upsetting. But the good news is that I had reached out to Breakthrough News, because when it was becoming clear that I still wasn't sure if they were going to run the monologue, but when I realized that there was definitely a good chance that they wouldn't run the monologue, I wanted to make sure. I didn't want to waste this script. I didn't want to they could censor me, fine, but I didn't want the world to censor me. So I reached out to Breakthrough News, to Rania Kalik, and I showed them the script, and they loved the script. So then when they fired me on Wednesday, I was like, okay, let's do it. And so we filmed it on Thursday morning, and then we released it. And you can find this video at youtube.com/the Katie Halper Show, as well as youtube.com/Breakthrough News. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I'm just going to one second. Okay, how is the sound? Nope, wrong one. So, 1 second.
See, they're silencing us yet again. This is what happens when you talk about this issue.
Yeah, possibly that must be
the
it.
NSA, the CIA, who knows who it is? Yeah.
How
Maybe
is
The
it
Hill
now?
has
How's
hacked
the
into
sound
this. You count to 10? Yeah, I think so. Let's see.
I can't hear you. 1 second.
But I am glad that person asked me that question, because I find it very frustrating. I understand it. I get that people may assume you're at this corporate mainstream outlet. Of course, they weren't going to let you talk about Israel. But the truth is, again, as I said, I had no idea that this would be a problem, because I had spoken about Israel several times. There is this organization that's ironically named, you may know about them, Lowkey, but it's an ironically named organization called Honest Reporting. And it basically exists to harass people who dare criticize Israel. And they had written a piece about me called What the Hill, really clever name, where they went after me for criticizing Israel. So it's possible that, The Hill had felt motivated by that. I'd like to think that they could stand up to, the harassment campaigns and bullying campaigns that often accompany people covering Israel. I should also add that I'm Jewish. I'm not religious. I'm like a Bernie Sanders Jew. That's like my reference. I'm culturally Jewish, and I come from a long line of secular Jews, leftist secular Jews. But that didn't, I'm still called an anti-Semite. I guess I have the luxury of being called a self-loathing Jew more than an anti-Semite, which is like one layer better. But it's interesting that, as much as people like to pretend that they care about identity politics, it didn't matter that I was Jewish. Now, I should also say, I want to be clear that it shouldn't matter that you're Jewish. Like, you don't have to be Jewish to be able to criticize Israel, but we live in a world where, unfortunately, you're given more legitimacy. So I do try to use my voice as a Jew to show not all Jews believe the things that AIPAC believes, and not all Jews believe the things that the ADL believes, because the irony is that what the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, what they're doing is they're suggesting that all Jews are a monolith and all Jews have the same position on Israel. And that, ironically, is an anti-Semitic trope. I mean, that is an anti-Semitic trope in itself, that being Jewish means you are pro-Israel. Being Jewish means you support the Israeli government. That's where the dual loyalty stereotype comes from. That's where also there are a lot of anti-Semites who throw around the word Zionist in a way to mean Jews. So it's interesting that you have anti-Semites conflating Jewishness with Zionism, and you also have the ADL and AIPAC conflating those two things.
So, Katie, just to confirm that I actually can be heard,
Yes.
my next question is, what was the article that you recently in the Jacobin, and what did it reveal about you?
Yeah, so there's a really good Jacobin article. Where did it go? I had it open. That Branko Marcetic wrote. Let me just get it open. It's called Left-Wing Journalist Katie Halper has been fired for calling Israel an apartheid state. And I'm just going to quote the article or some parts of it because it's very short. I'll give you the link in case you want to have it to show, although that's not necessary. Here, I'm just putting the private chat. So Branko writes that the Hill was bought by the media conglomerate Nexstar Media Group, Inc. for $130 million in last August. Then in September, Psagot Value Holdings Limited, an investment firm based in Tel Aviv, bought 6,100 shares in Nexstar to the tune of more than $1 million. Also in late August, Nexstar filled the position of deputy managing editor of News Nation, its cable channel, with Jake Novak, a journalist who spent the preceding year and a half as the media director of the Israeli Consulate General in New York. Novak has written approvingly of Donald Trump's dropping of U.S. support for the two-state solution, and he's advocated for Israel to build more settlements, saying it would, quote, bring more peace, prosperity, and freedom to both Israelis and Arabs, end quote. And 6 days before the announcement of his hiring, Novak led a presentation at Bar Ilan University titled Defending Israel Against Media Bias, How to Fight News Media and Social Media Bias Against Israel. The best defense is a good offense. So,
great. Thank you for that. Now, just to check on my audio again, an audio check. What I have uncovered researching some of this information here are some quite interesting overlaps. So, for example, as was pointed out by Katie then, the owner of the Hill is Nexstar Media Group. Now, Nexstar Media Group's number one shareholder is the hedge fund Vanguard. Now, Vanguard not only has a charitable endowment fund, which gives money to the ADL, so that's quite an interesting crossover there. It also has funneled money into the Friends of the IDF, into the Center for Security Policy, which is responsible for the Muslim ban. It's also funneled into the Central Fund of Israel. What we also know, along with a panoply of other pro-Israel organizations, that Vanguard actually owns 22 million shares in Lockheed Martin. It owns over $3 billion worth of shares in Raytheon. It owns almost $3 billion worth of shares in Honeywell International, which claims to have hardware in almost every military aircraft in the world. And it also has about $2 billion in Boeing. But if we also look at the employees of Vanguard, what we see is that you have a business specialist employed by Vanguard, who is formerly an analyst of Unit 8200, which is the Israeli military intelligence surveillance unit. You also have a digital analytics employee at Vanguard by the name of Anna Sirianov, who is formerly an economic intelligence analyst in the Israeli military, and also after that went on to work in the Israeli Ministry of Economics. Now, in addition to the Vanguard connection when it comes to the Hill, another key shareholder in Nexstar Media Group is Psagot, which is an Israeli company that is one of the largest shareholders in Israeli arms company. It has almost 1 million shares in that Israeli arms company. In addition to that, another interesting connection here, which I think should be looked into more, is the presence on the Nexstar board of Thomas Macmillan. Now, Thomas Macmillan previously was a member of Congress, and before that was a basketball player in the NBA. Now, he has made clear that he has a lot of sympathy, we could say, for Israel. He said, I don't think we should succumb to terrorists. The Israelis never do, and we shouldn't either. But who else is Thomas Macmillan, this director of Nexstar? He is somebody who was a close associate of Jeffrey Epstein. So much so,
Jeffrey Epstein, in case his glitch sound went, I want to make sure people heard what you said. Jeffrey Epstein, yes.
Yes. So Jeffrey Epstein, we see here, this is Thomas Macmillan on the left, the tall gentleman there in the video now being played, who is on the board of directors for Nexstar, which owns the Hill. And he's featured here at Epstein's party alongside Donald Trump. I think it was actually Trump's party that Epstein was a guest at, but he is also included in Epstein's Black Book. Now, what else I wanted to say about this situation with your dismissal is a key thing to understand about Jeffrey Epstein is that according to his longtime mentor, Stephen Hoffenberg, who was found dead a few months ago, Epstein was introduced to Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, by a very close associate, the British defense contractor, Douglas Leese. And it was from there that, according to Stephen Hoffenberg, Epstein was able to begin working for Israeli intelligence. And Stephen Hoffenberg actually asserts that Epstein boasted about how he was selling Prince Andrew's secrets to the Israeli intelligence agency, external agency Mossad. So what we have is an interesting situation here where Thomas Macmillan, who is the board of directors for Nexstar, clearly has some type of political orientation. What we also know is that his time in Congress, he was being funded by Donald Trump. And now when we look at Nexstar, we know that key figures within Nexstar also funded mainly the Republican Party, but also Donald Trump. Now, what do you think about this information? And do you think it's possible that some of these aspects, like the top shareholder in Nexstar being Vanguard having these type of overlaps, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty damning either way. I'm just hearing about this, so I want to thank you for finding this stuff out. I think that it could potentially, I mean, I'm just hearing about this, but it sounds like it's definitely a potential explanation for part of perhaps for why they'd have this position. Again, it's a scary thing either way because Nexstar is really becoming extremely powerful. It owns a lot of media. It bought Tribune Media in 2019 and it's become the largest local broadcast TV owner in the United States. So what you're saying is scary in itself, and it's that much scarier knowing how powerful Nexstar is. Lowkey, can I ask you something? Is there a way, sorry to interrupt this, but
Yeah.
Just because your sound is glitchy, is there a way you can do a local recording of yourself, like on your cell phone? That way, if you release this as a podcast or even later as video segments, you'll be able to sync it up. Just an idea, because what you're saying is so important. I want to make sure that.
Believe it or not, in terms of this, the sound, the audio issue, I've tried from 4 different angles to feed the audio into this live stream. So directly from the computer, from the microphone, and directly from the camera. So there's something clearly very wrong.
Right. But if you do like a local recording, even if it doesn't broadcast now, you could use it later for editing. You may want to do that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. We will try to do that.
While you're doing that, I can take
I guess another question I would then ask would be, what other cases do you see in mainstream media being silenced around this issue of Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, this is not sadly, this is a pretty typical thing to have happen. We saw this with Mark Lamont Hill, who was fired from CNN. We saw this Norman Finkelstein in terms of academia. He was basically denied tenure thanks to people like Alan Dershowitz, another friend of Epstein, by the way. Juan Cole was basically had an offer rescinded from Yale University, probably for his criticism of Israel. Stephen Salaita was fired basically from a university over, of all things, tweeting about Israel's assault on Gaza. I mean, the fact that you could get in trouble from tweeting on your personal account. He didn't say anything anti-Semitic. He didn't say anything kind of provocative, and he was fired from his job. And now he's actually been working as a bus driver for years because he was not able to find an academic job. Nathan Robinson also was lost his job as a columnist at the Guardian for literally making a very, very not offensive joke about how the punchline was about how the United States gives Israel arms and funding. I mean, that was it. There was nothing, again, no anti-Semitic tropes. It's just a reality on the ground. If you're upset by that reality, you should be upset by that reality. It's not anti-Semitic. It's the truth.
There was also the case of Mark Lamont Hill. I wonder, Katie, have any of these people
at CNN, right?
Yeah, any of these people who have previously been cancelled, they reached out to you, and has there been communication with them?
Well, Juan Cole wrote a piece about what happened, which was great. He's a great website called Informed Comment. Mondo Weiss wrote a piece about it. I know that Phil Weiss was also censored over criticizing Israel. I would love to connect to Mark Lamont Hill. I haven't. I was able to meet Rashida Tlaib, which was great. I was invited to a fundraiser for her. And I got to say, Rashida Tlaib is very, very funny. She's a very good storyteller. Roger Waters tweeted in support of this. He brought it up on the Joe Rogan show. So yeah, I mean, I think there should be, would love to do. Oh, and then I had Norman Finkelstein on, who was denied tenure. Norman Finkelstein is fascinating because he is a very good political scientist, really prolific. And he is the son of Holocaust survivors. And he actually talks about part of the reason he cares about this question and is so passionate about Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights is because of what was done to his parents. But I would like to do a panel, like a large panel. Next week, I'm having on my show Noura Erakat, this brilliant Palestinian American human rights lawyer, as well as Miko Peled, who is the son of an Israeli general. His mother's father was one of the signatories to Israeli independence. So he has this very larger than life, almost like Israeli royalty family. And what's fascinating about Miko Peled is that he also tragically lost his niece in a suicide bombing. And his father, who was this decorated general, over the course of his life really shifted in terms of his view of Israel. And he became a really fierce believer in a two-state solution. Miko Peled was a fierce believer in the two-state solution and now believes in a one-state solution. I just reread his book, which is great. It's called The General's Son, an Israeli in Palestine. And he interestingly enough, he kind of suspects that had his father lived long enough, he would have joined him politically. And Noura Erakat is, again, brilliant. She's the author of this great book, Justice for Some. So I'm definitely going to keep covering this. And again, I would like to do a big panel with people who have been canceled over this. And I also, of course, want to point out that, I'm so relatively lucky and fortunate. I've received a lot of support. Also, this wasn't my only show. I still have my show, The Katie Halper Show, and I have Useful Idiots. I was ranting from behind a, safe in the United States. I'm based in DC, I'm based in New York City, but I recorded that monologue in DC at the Hills Studios. Then I recorded it at Breakthrough News in the city, but I'm not there are Palestinian journalists who are on the ground who, as we know, will pay with their lives for covering this, as we saw with Shireen Abu Akleh, but also several other Palestinian journalists who have been killed because Israel, one of the many atrocious things that they do is they really don't refrain from targeting journalists. We saw this at the right of return marches.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also one interesting point here is that the original campaign that you were responding against was the ADL. And it turns out that Vanguard, the top shareholder in the company which owns the Hill, actually has a charitable arm that funds the ADL. What do you have to say about the ADL as an organization?
Yeah, the ADL, I by the way, I really highly recommend this documentary. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called Defamation. It's fascinating. It's by this Jewish Israeli who travels from Israel to the United States to kind of look into what ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, does. And because he's an Israeli Jew, I think they think that he's going to be sympathetic. So they're very transparent with him. And he winds up making this documentary that is a totally damning expose of ADL. And you see how, he asked them for examples of anti-Semitism, and they don't really have any. They have like one cop who wants to who's covering a funeral for someone who's Jewish. And he's like, I can't wait to get out of here. I mean, now what's so frustrating about the ADL, and Ali Abu Nima, who I had on my show a couple weeks ago, talked about this, is that they really function to, I would say, trivialize the legitimate anti-Semitism that exists. I mean, we've seen these white supremacist attacks against synagogues. And what the ADL does is they kind of both sides anti-Semitism. So they're like, okay, yeah, we have people who literally shoot people, murder people who are white supremacist terrorists on the right. But then on the left, you have these anti-Semites who are critical of Israel, which is the most asymmetrical comparison. And it's really offensive to people who take anti-Semitism seriously, because, of course, by calling criticism of Israel anti-Semitic, you're really trivializing anti-Semitism. You're just trying to use that to stifle people, to delegitimize their critiques. And another important thing to point out is that I'm reading Ilan Pappé's 10 Myths About Israel. And one of the fascinating things about it is that there really is a long history of anti-Zionist Jews for many reasons. You have religious Jews who, I mean, this is not my orientation, obviously, but they think that Jews can't go back to Israel until they're told by God. And I guess God hasn't told them that yet. And then you have historically, you had reform Jews who thought that Zionism would increase anti-Semitism and distrust of Jews. And then you have, of course, radical Jews or progressive Jews who just think that this is not good obviously not good for Palestinians, but also not good for Jews. And the ADL, the ADL also has done trainings for, the ADL also was, I have to do a deep dive into this, but I know that they did some suspicious things during actual South African apartheid. So I still have to do a segment on that.
Well, actually, when he went to the United States, they also spied on other groups, including unions. They with the FBI from 1968, despite the fact that the FBI, in internal memo in 1969, it read the following: "It is incredible to assume that the ADL was not furnished to an official of the Israeli government." That's something that the FBI said about the ADL while it was actually working with the ADL. Wow. And today, the ADL is the largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the United States. So the question,
they do this thing called they do police exchanges, between the U.S. and Israel to help militarize the police here. Precisely.
You are someone that does work in different places, but you've also been able to build your own independent media. How have you gone about doing that, and what advice can you give to other people hoping to do the same thing?
So I started doing what happened was I actually started, sorry, I'm about to sneeze. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay, I thought I was. I started doing the morning show at WBAI. Morning show is WBAI is the New York affiliate of Pacifica Radio, and so it's where, for instance, Amy Goodman got her start. But she so I started there. I started on the morning show. I'm not really a morning person, so I pitched them the Katie Halper show. I pitched them my own show. I started doing that. I then turned that into a podcast. So I would turn my radio show into a podcast, and then I decided to kind of do it in reverse, and I would do a podcast that I would play on the radio. And then during COVID, I had wanted to do videos for a while. And during COVID, I decided to do, because I was home a lot. So I decided to do a live stream show. So now my show, the Katie Halper Show, is basically a live stream on YouTube that I then turn into both shorter clips. And you can find this all at youtube.com/the Katie Halper Show. I'd really invite people to please subscribe and like the videos. But I do a weekly live stream, and then I release shorter clips throughout the week. And I also turn it into a podcast, and then I turn that into a radio show. And I also have Patreon at patreon.com/the Katie Halper Show, which is where I release extended interviews or separate interviews. This week, I'm interviewing Kit Clarenberger about his piece at the Gray Zone about the bombing of the bridge to Crimea. He has some really damning information about the British intelligence community. And then I also, Matt Taibbi, before the pandemic, I can't even remember what year now, but he invited me to co-host a podcast that we started called Useful Idiots. We started that at Rolling Stone. Then we left, we went independent. Matt Taibbi is writing a book now, so he's on book leave, and Aaron Mate is my co-host now at Useful Idiots. So I have those two shows. I think what happened, honestly, is that the way that my show kind of got attention was, I think that during 2016, I started my radio show in 2015, but during 2016, there was so much smearing of Bernie Sanders as sexist, and people were really excited about a woman's voice who was a supporter of Bernie Sanders and a critic of Hillary Clinton, something I really talked about. I was like so constantly infuriated by the way Sanders, and I have critiques of him, and I'm sure your viewers have critiques of him, but they're certainly not that he's sexist. And the weaponization of identity politics that we saw during the campaign was just disgusting. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, but Hillary Clinton actually said, well, breaking up the banks and racism, no, which was her way of kind of like mocking Bernie Sanders. Now, what's so embarrassing about that is that, of course, breaking up the banks won't end racism. No one has ever said it will end racism, but we also should be honest about that. The housing crisis, that was a racialized crisis. I mean, because of the way racism works in the United States. And actually, the people who suffered the most from that, not surprisingly, were Black people. So to pretend that these things are unrelated is just laughable. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I understand that you do have to leave us quite soon.
I have until 55. So, okay. I mean, you have to leave, no worries. But
no. Okay, that's absolutely fine. And so then I wanted to ask your perspective as somebody functioning in the media. Where would you suggest, if people want to get the real news coming out of Palestine? We know that you're not able to get it on CNN and definitely not able to get it on The Hill. Where should they look to get their information regarding what's happening?
So, well, you guys are, of course, a great source of information. You do great work. Alan McLeod does great work at Mint Press. Electronic Intifada, Manda Weiss, Noura Erakat is someone who I would definitely follow on Twitter and follow her work. Those are just some of the people I'd recommend. Adala, the human rights organization, the kind of legal studies organization, that's not the right word, but they do a lot about the law. And they're someone who I looked at their website quite a bit when I was looking for examples of Israeli law that fit the definition of apartheid. And again, I'm going to keep talking about this. So you can, of course, join me next week. Oh, someone just wrote this. This is good. Breaking the Silence. Yes. Yeshdin, B'Tselem. All of those are great sources also. And it's funny because I've been getting some people. There was a piece in the Daily Beast. Someone was responding to my op-ed. I wrote an op-ed in the Daily Beast. And this has been a common argument I've heard from people. They're like, oh, it's not apartheid because it's not racial. And then they cite Amnesty International's definition of apartheid. I'm like, well, Amnesty International says it's apartheid. So either they're a reliable source or they're not. And also, I don't think they realize that in saying this, they're kind of reifying race, which is, of course, a social construct. I mean, I think I'm actually going to address this with Noura Ericott on my show next week. And then, of course, I would just really encourage people to watch the video and share the video, which is at youtube.com/The Katie Halper Show. You can also follow me on Twitter at Katie Halps. That's letter K, letter T, HALPS. And yeah, I really, Jeffrey Halper, who's no relation that I know of, is another person whose work I really admire. He's working on a one-state solution from Israel. He's an American Jew who moved to Israel. Diana Butu is someone who I'm going to have on the show. And my show is usually Tuesday evenings, but I'm going to be doing a special Sunday daytime broadcast coming up so I can have people from Israel, from Palestine on the show, and they don't have to be up at ridiculously late hour for them. JVP is another great organization, Jewish Voices for Peace. I'm actually doing a panel tonight. Let's see if I can find it. It is, let's see. It is a webinar that I'm doing. I can put the link in later on, but it's happening. If you go to Katie Halps on Twitter, I'll put it in my, I'll put it there. I'll also put it on my website, which is katiehalper.com. But I'm doing an event with Muslims for Palestine, is the organization, American Muslims for Palestine. So we're doing a panel tonight. It's I think it's 4 Jewish people talking about what happens when you try to talk about this stuff.
A comment here saying Lowkey is definitely one of the journalists that gets spied on. What do you think in terms of yourself? What do you think in terms of surveillance of journalists in the United States? Have you seen any evidence of that?
Maybe I'm in denial, or maybe I haven't wanted to look. I don't know. I certainly would find it totally credible. I don't know of that case, but I wouldn't be surprised because as we see, there's a very apparent, and I have to say as a Jew, I hate this. I hate that there's a reality that people can then turn into an anti-Semitic stereotype. But the Israel lobby is very powerful. Now, one thing that I like to remind people of when they say that you're being an anti-Semite by talking about that is, luckily, in terms of numbers, most Zionists are Christian because there are a lot more Christians than Jews in the world. So that's an important thing to remember when people are suggesting that, it's anti-Semitic to talk about the Israel lobby. And it's only anti-Semitic if you conflate the Israel lobby with all Jews. Most Jews aren't part of this Israel lobby. So that's another important thing to remember. And I think also, that it's just, yeah.
Also, most Jews are not actually Israeli citizens. There's only
right. There's that too, right?
Are Israeli citizens, but there's 15 million Jewish people in the world.
Right.
So by that, we can deduce something. So one of the interesting things about this issue of surveillance is that one of the organizations that is funded by the charitable arm of the Vanguard hedge fund is the Investigative Project on Terrorism, which is founded. Now that was found.
Which was what? Sorry, we missed the last thing you said.
It was founded by Steve Emerson, and it was found to be infiltrating and spying on CARE and feeding information back to the Israeli government. So the audio is.
CARE stands for Council on American and Islamic Relations. That one? That CARE?
I think so. Yeah. So it seems that my audio is still, we've tried from several different angles to address this audio situation. I think it's best if we call it a day. Thank you so much for joining us. Katie, if you have anything you would like to add, please go ahead.
No, just thank you so much for having me, and keep on doing the great work that you do. And I really invite people to subscribe at youtube.com/The Katie Halper Show, because I want to make sure that these videos that I'm going to continue doing, I don't have the audience at the Hill anymore, but I want to make sure we can grow the audience at the Katie Halper Show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.